We'll go ahead and get started. My name is Robert Watson. I am a member of the FreeBSD Core Team and president of the FreeBSD Foundation. I also am at the University of Cambridge, where I'm currently working on a PhD in computer security. Before I came to Cambridge, I did research at a series of companies starting with trusted information systems and ending up at SPARTA. We did work for DARPA, the US National Security Agency, Apple Computer, various others doing computer security work. And much of what I'm going to talk to you about today is an outcome of about 6 years of that work. And it's been gradually going through the research process and then growing into products and so on. So that's basically where I come from. I thought about coming in and saying, hello, I'm Sam Leffler. Okay. What I'm going to do is introduce you to some of the advanced security features that are present in FreeBSD 5, 6, and 7. Some of these features came in around the late FreeBSD 4 series, but most of them became production features in FreeBSD 6. And there are one or two things I'll describe to you that appear in FreeBSD 7 for the first time. In order to understand these features, we also need to understand a little bit about the Unix security model itself. So I'll spend a couple of minutes at the beginning talking about what the Unix security model actually is. Most of the things that I'll tell you about are extensions to it, but are fairly natural extensions. They address well-understood weaknesses in the Unix security model, be it the level of granularity and flexibility, the degree of accuracy or detail in logging, security properties of the logging system, and so on. So I think once we have an understanding of the Unix security model, the position that these extensions, the role these extensions play, will become a bit more clear. The Unix security model comes out of Unix System Labs and Bell Labs and so on, and is basically unchanged, I guess, 30 years later. Unix is a multi-user system. You have many different users running around on the system. Users, in the context of Unix, might refer to a specific end user who's authenticated when they use the computer. They might refer to system services that will run in isolation from each other and have different security requirements. But fundamentally, this is the way that Unix works, and it's worked for a very long time. And if you install your Mac OS X box today, you'll find that underneath there are Unix users, or if you use Linux, even if it's just a desktop system, underneath you can find all these Unix bits. A lot of work has gone on in the security, both security research and product development since this multi-user process-based security model was developed. And FreeBSD comes with a lot of security features that weren't present in Unix. And these sort of begin with secure levels, which is work done correctly, but go into a lot of other things. And some of these things you'll find in other Unix systems, some you won't. What I'm going to focus on today are work that came out of the TrustedBSD project, which was one of these research projects funded by DARPA and other agencies and companies. So I'm going to talk specifically about access control lists, security event auditing, and some of the mandatory access control features. And I won't have you ever spend a lot of time on any individual feature, but I sort of want to give you a survey of these features, and also tell you a little bit about the history of the features and some of the things you should know if you think about deploying them. And I think they give greater insight into the Unix model, as you understand it. Some things I won't talk about. I won't talk about a lot of the work that's taking place in cryptography, which of course has been cryptographic protocols and so on, being one of the big areas of new work in operating system security. If you look at operating system security in the 1970s, really nothing has changed in the systems that we ship today. Maybe they come with more complete features, maybe they're on your desktop instead of in a back room taking up 2 or 3 rooms. But there actually hasn't been a lot of new operating system security work except in the area of distributed systems. And I won't really focus on distributed systems in this talk. The TrustedBSD project was founded in April 2000. The goal of the project was to provide what we'll call trusted operating system features on the FreeBSD operating system platform. This can mean a lot of different things to different people. Traditionally, in trusted operating systems, there are 2 focuses of work. One is on providing features that aren't otherwise present in the operating system. And these are things like security event auditing, mandatory access control. And the other is something called assurance, which is the process by which you argue that the system actually does have the security properties you want, the ones that are implemented by security features or just part of the structure of the operating system. In about 2001, we received DARPA funding for the project, and since then there have been a series of sponsors ranging from the US Navy to Apple Computer, who's also sponsored significant parts of the work. And the work continues today. Some of the work was very much research work. Some of our work on extensible kernel security, how do you change the security policy in an operating system, was definitely research. Other areas really revolved around bringing features that already in other operating systems to an open source operating system. 4 or 5 years ago, if you wanted security auditing, event auditing in an operating system, you had to buy a commercial product. You could go to Solaris, you could go to Windows NT, but you certainly couldn't go to an open source operating system to get this feature, which was a real problem for deploying open source operating systems in banking environments and military environments and so on. So we wanted to try and provide those features. Most of the features implemented as part of the TrustedBSD project are now considered mature. They're ready for use in production environments. There's some that are still getting there and some that are still on the roadmap. I'd also point out that these features were all present in FreeBSD, but many of them are now also present in macOS 10 or will be present in macOS 10 as of the upcoming release of Leopard, which includes the mandatory access control framework we developed in FreeBSD and has been picked up by Apple. Also, the audit work was actually developed under contract to Apple and is now being merged into FreeBSD, and we hope that Apple will pick up a lot of the changes we've made in FreeBSD and merge them back into macOS 10 for the next release as well. So we'll talk a little bit about FreeBSD security architecture. And as I said, this is very much a Unix security architecture. It revolves around a monolithic kernel, a single piece of software running in a single address space that is basically the trusted bit of the operating system. This is the bit that you place all confidence in. If this is compromised, then you are screwed. On top of the kernel, run a series of processes. These are isolated virtual machines, essentially. They run pretty much in isolation from each other. They must communicate with each other through the kernel. And so the kernel plays a role in mediating access between them, be it inter-process communication, access to shared objects like the file system, or resources like the network stack. The process model you found developed in Unix is now found in pretty much every other operating system, Windows, all the Unix derivatives. It's a very simple model, and it's a very effective model for isolating pieces of software from each other. And all of the Unix security really rests on the foundation of isolation that's present in the process model. It says that when something is running in one process, unless it explicitly acts through the kernel, it's not going to be communicating with any other process. It won't interfere with them, it won't be subject to their whims. Accidental writes to memory won't turn up in one process from the other unless some explicit action has been taken to make that possible. The Unix kernel also provides something called a credential, and the processes each have a credential. And this is a series of security tags that tell you about the process from the perspective of security. And in the classic Unix model, these are user IDs and group IDs. These are things that allow you to subset, so to break down processes into groups that have similar security properties. And everything else sort of builds on top of that as well. In classic Unix, there's a privileged root user who's able to do anything and is used for system management purposes. This is certainly true in FreeBSD still. Some Unix systems have managed to break away from this. Systems like macOS 10 still have the notion of a privileged root user, even if that user is never out to log in. There are still processes running as root in order to gain privilege. And I should be specific about what I mean by privilege. In this context, privilege means the right to violate constraints of the security policy. So the ability to violate protections between users, to change the ownership of files, to modify the file system namespaces, do things that would violate the security properties that the overall policy depends on. So that's what we mean by privilege. Most of the new security features I'm going to talk about are natural extensions to this. They don't fundamentally change the model. They augment it in various ways. They do things that were missing in the original picture. Short briefly about access control. So I said privilege is the right to violate access control policies. Access control policies come in a variety of flavors. I'll talk about them more, but at a high level, access control policies may be fixed. They may be part of the operating system design. They may be controlled using user-definable policies, either the administrator or another one, and we'll refine that concept a little. So here's the picture. The kernel is this omnipresent piece of software that's mediating accesses, and all these processes are running isolated from each other. And exactly the nature of the isolation isn't too relevant, but it includes address space protection. It includes things like controls on signaling and all sorts of things. The kernel is, of course, sitting here mediating every request. And mediation is an expensive process. It requires CPU cycles, it requires memory accesses. So we do it in a somewhat restrained way. We don't do it every time there's an access. We often do it up front when communication is initiated, and then we allow it to continue indefinitely, and maybe we don't even support revoking it. In the Unix model, objects in the system are on the whole owned by a user. It might be the root user, it might be any other user. And we break down protections into two kinds of protections. One of them is mandatory protections, and the other is discretionary. The only distinction between those two words has to do with who is setting the policy. A mandatory policy is administered by a security administrator or the system administrator, and users cannot change those protections. They are universally subject to protections. A discretionary policy is one in which the owner of an object sets the protections. So Unix permissions are by definition discretionary. Anyone who owns the object can change the protections. Maybe someone else can, maybe they can't. Mandatory policies are very important for enforcing things like information flow, for protecting services from each other. Discretionary policies are very useful. They allow users to collaborate and share information, but they're also very unreliable because you have to rely on the users doing the right thing. They have to manage all these permissions themselves. Users are bad enough at managing files, let alone the permissions on the files. So in environments where you have security requirements for the isolation of users, discretionary protections are not enough. And so a lot of the work that we did as part of this project was to introduce mandatory protections. So what kind of things are typically mandatory in a classic Unix system? The ability to debug processes or deliver signals. No matter what the user does, they can't expose the ability to deliver a signal to that process. The operating system kernel prevents delivering signals to processes that aren't owned by the user. For example, another example in Unix is you cannot delegate the ability to set the permissions on a file. That's something only the owner can do. They can do it on behalf of the request of another process, but they must do it themselves. That isn't a delegatable right. And in discretionary protections, the file permissions are probably the best example, but the same kind of permission scheme also exists for inter-process communication objects, such as System 5 IPC. So on top of this kernel, which provides a pretty basic set of primitives, isolation, some notion of credentials and so on, we actually build most of what people recognize as the Unix policy entirely in user space. The kernel does not hard code things, concepts like authentication. It doesn't say how to use user IDs or group IDs. It simply says they exist and then it enforces some basic protections. Everything else is implemented in user space. So the notion that users authenticate and log into the system, the notion of logging into the system, the notion of network access, these are all entirely concepts represented in the Unix user space. And you can, of course, change them, and people do. The kernel provides some very low-level primitives. I said process isolation, notions of credentials and privilege, set UID, which is this gateway to escalate privilege, object ownership and access control. The kernel knows nothing about passwords, remote access home directories. All of this is user space. So what are some things we find in user space? Authentication and the mapping of communication channels to users. These user IDs by themselves are meaningless. Who do you assign UIDs to? Do you assign them to every task run by the user? Do you assign different UIDs to different tasks? That's all controlled. In the usual Unix model, you basically say every end user gets an account and a password. When they log in, you start marking all their processes as owned by it. And due to the way the user ID policy works, once a process has been assigned unprivileged UID, it can't easily get back to being privileged again. Concepts like PAM are also entirely user space. And you can see the side effects of this when you look at the behavior of the Unix system. There's some odd things happen. If you change the group file, all the processes don't magically get updated to have the new list of groups for each user. You actually have to wait till the user logs out and logs back in again before the processes are marked. And the reason is that the processes get marked when the user logs in, and then there's no change in those identifiers later. And this actually causes problems, the revocation problem, in which you take someone out of the group, but yet that processes keep on running and keep having access. And this is a cache consistency issue, and it comes directly out of the architecture that I've described. Okay. So this is a layered model. We have a kernel that's a trusted piece of software, that is marking as this isolation. And then we have user space that layers more mature notions that administrators want to deal with, things like passwords and so on top of this layered model. So there are some obvious limits to this model. There are certain things that are very difficult to deal with in the Unix model, and each of the features we talk about will address some of those. I'm going to talk briefly about access control lists. Access control lists are actually somewhat controversial. They ship in basically every operating system that's available. They are mandated by the Orange Book and Common Criteria. And so if your system is evaluated to be used in any military or government environment, it must have access control lists. So that's why you find it in everything from Windows, IRIX, to FreeBSD Linux. And the details do vary. There are basically two kinds of access control lists floating around. Something called POSIX 1E ACLs, and another type called perhaps NTFS ACLs or NFSv4 ACLs. And they're always kind of split into two camps on this. And the unfortunate thing is that they are not really mutually intelligible. You kind of have to pick one or the other. And Samba is probably the piece of software that does the best job of trying to make them live side by side, and even that is uncomfortable. It is impossible to accurately represent the access control concepts represented in one of these schemes in the other one in any human manageable way. There's an IETF draft on how you might do it, and you just have to read the draft, and you read between the lines, and it says, don't ever do this. So you kind of have to pick one. At the time we implemented ACLs for FreeBSD, POSIX 1E was clearly the way to go. All of the commercial Unix systems either implemented POSIX 1E ACLs or something that was very, very similar. Maybe the APIs were a little different, the semantics were fundamentally the same. So we live in the world of Linux, IRIX, and Solaris. A little later, Windows comes along, and Windows ACLs are different, as I said. They're not compatible. And those were picked up in NFS v4. Presumably, the reason for that was that the people working on NFS v4 believed that Windows was the client architecture of choice, and the servers needed to provide what the clients needed. And out of that falls Mac OS X's ACL model, which is also the NTFS ACL model. And most recently, Solaris' ZFS has adopted that, and presumably that is in large part to support NFS v4 ACLs. Until relatively recently, the semantics of those ACLs were very poorly defined. If you looked at the NFS v4 specification, they basically said, go look at Windows. But that has recently been resolved through a lot of work by Sun to make ZFS work with NFS v4. So that's improved. So we implement POSIX 20 ACLs, and if you use Samba, magic mapping takes place. It's not pretty, but your end users will be able to manage the ACLs using the NT ACL manager over SPFS. In FreeBSD, we store access controllers and extended attributes. This essentially means you need to be running UFS 2. This is all right. We've been shipping UFS 2 for years. It is the default. So there's nothing really special you need to do there. We ship support for ACLs in the default generic kernel, so if you install FreeBSD, the support is there. You do need to administratively enable access controllers for each file system you want to be present. The reason we do this is that as an administrator, you will want to know if extended access controls are used because you want to make sure it is backed up properly and that your users aren't doing surprising things. If you write Unix scripts that assume everything is just permissions, then you may run into trouble with access control lists, as your scripts won't understand them. They may get unexpected results. So we require them to be turned on. We may have somewhat changed this default. Under Unix file permissions, they're essentially a very small access control list. The owner of the file, the group of the file, and other each get read, write, or execute access. POSIX 20 ACLs are an extension to this. They allow you to assign rights to additional users and additional groups. And the goal of doing this is pretty obvious. The problem with the Unix model is that anytime users want to collaborate usefully in a group, the administrator has to create the group for them. The administrator has to take the special explicit action to set up access control so that they can share data in a meaningful way. So that users can say, oh, this user is allowed to read it, these two are allowed to write it, or this group is allowed these special rights. To do it by default, the administrator must be involved. And for scalable system administration, that is a disaster. It just doesn't make any sense. So access control lists are intended specifically to address the concern of how do you let users manage the protections of their own objects. And they pretty much do that. What they do is they allow you to add additional fields, which is this user or this group has additional rights. So it's quite straightforward. With the exception of the ACL mask, which is provided for compatibility with permissions, so that your applications kind of behave the right way. And there's a disagreement in the Unix community about how the mask should behave, whether it should be conservative with respect to security or permissive. And increasingly, systems are slightly permissive. Right now, FreeBSD does what spec says, which is conservative, but for reasons of compatibility and user expectation, we probably ought to change. Here's an example of ACL. Over on the left-hand side, what you interpret permissions, where you can say the user, the owner can have read-write access, group can have read, another can have nothing. But in a nice world of ACLs, or the mediocre world of ACLs, we can actually say somewhat more mature things, such as specific users can have read-write access, maybe the group can have read access. And the mask is a mask of all the rights delegated using user and group entries other than the file owner. So if you chmod a file and you change the group fields, it will mask the rights assigned to all the other users. So if you chmod 0600, that is to say, take away read and write access for other and group using the chmod command, it will mask out all other rights delegated using ACLs. And the result is you get conservative behavior if the application only speaks permissions. The difference in Solaris, Linux, and now IRIX is that they don't take a conservative perspective when they're creating new children directories. It has to do with how you combine the umask and the mask in the default ACL. And it allows users to essentially override the umask using an ACL, and this is not conservative behavior. There are two commands you use. Get ACL is used to read ACLs, set ACL is used to write them. You can run get ACL on a file that doesn't have an ACL on it, and you get back the normal set of permissions. But if you run it on a file that has ACLs, you get all these additional entries. And it's pretty straightforward to use. And you always have the basic fields from permissions and the owner group, so applications pretty much use the APIs they used to. The only other interesting quirk is you have a default ACL on directories. This tells you whether anything special needs to be done with new entries in the directory. Do you want to have an ACL for every entry created in the directory or not, and what should be in it? And that also kind of behaves the way you expect. A couple of tools, LS is extended, tar is able to back them up, dump is able to back them up, and actually now I believe restore is able to restore them. Something about it. And the man pages are fairly straightforward. And these are consistent with anything you find in pretty much any other Unix system, with the exception of Mac OS X. And there's documentation available. There's a tutorial in the FreeBSD handbook, and it's pretty extensive nowadays. So what handles do, well, they give you additional flexibility. One of the big criticisms of access control lists is the management model. If you thought permissions were bad, wait till you see access control lists. You have these things on every file in your file system, every one of them now has all this extended information. So just like with permissions, you end up managing whole subtrees and assigning the same app with all of them. And this is semi-desirable. Usually what people do is they assign an access control list to a parent directory for a project, and then they let all the access control lists manage themselves. And occasionally you get surprise users, and the sure it helps, but it's certainly no different from permissions. I'll tell you about security event auditing. I think security event auditing is actually, I'm sort of caught between manager access control and event auditing as being the most useful features that came out of the TrustedBSD project, with the possible exception of the UFS2 file system and the OpenPAM, which I think also very useful. If you've ever used syslog to try and figure out how to do a post-mortem analysis on your system, you've probably found it a somewhat limited tool. You can't trust things that you find there. Information can be inserted by attackers. All kinds of things can be wrong with it. There's no detail. You can't figure out who modified what files. Event auditing is really about addressing that concern. The standards for event auditing are Orange Book and Common Criteria. If you have your system evaluated, pretty much the requirements come out of those. There are basically three requirements: that the logs be secure, they be reliable, and that they be fine-grained. And out of fine-grained comes the requirement for configurability. Syslog logs are not secure. Anyone can inject log records into a syslog file. Anyone can run the syslog command line tool and say, oh, the kernel says that the following thing happened, or SSHD says the following thing happened. In macOS 10, they worked a little bit to resolve this. They can also log credential information with log entries when they get log files. But Unix log files are essentially useless for any reliable post-mortem analysis as written. Syslog is also highly unreliable. Anytime your system goes under heavy load, it may drop log records. This is because it uses Unix domain sockets between applications. It is intentionally lossy. If your system runs out of disk space, oh, well, I guess we'll throw away the log records. Or you want to distribute them over the network's busy, I guess we'll throw away the log records. Sort of a theme there. Syslog is also not very detailed. If you want to know who accessed what files in your system, Syslog will not do that. And all these things are required for common criteria evaluation. So these come in the form of a new logging system called audit. The historical use of audit is essentially post-mortem analysis. It's after the fact you want to assign blame. You want to figure out what went wrong and how did it happen. Your PHP-based web server had someone break into it somehow, you don't know how, and they defaced all your pages. What happened? Syslog will never tell you the answer to that question. But audit is intended to. These days, audit is more frequently used in intrusion detection, where you need a detailed event stream that will tell you what happened in the system that is software manageable and manipulatable, that you can pass through it all, you can do it in an automated way. Audit is definitely intended to support that. It has a machine-readable log format, unlike syslog. It's also used for live system monitoring and system debugging. If you have a detailed logging system, it's great for figuring out what actually happened in a debugging scenario, not just a security scenario. As I said, come out Orange Book common criteria. The C2 evaluation coming out of Orange Book requires auditing, so if you look at Windows, Windows has auditing also. And recently common criteria has evolved those requirements a bit. As I said, found in almost all commercial operating systems. Audit is probably the feature that's come latest to open source operating systems, which I'm actually kind of distressing. The way this works is audit log files are like other log files. They contain a stream of events. In audit files, these are called records, and audit files are referred to as trails, or a trail of records as the system operates. Each record describes an individual event. It's a look like a line in the syslog file. It comes with a date stamp and a time stamp, and it tells you about the event and who did it and all these other things. Events can also be attributable, that is to say that they can be attributed back to some authenticated user, or unattributable, which means that no user authentication led directly to the event that you've seen. And this is an important distinction in standards. We also have this notion of selection, which has to do with deciding what to log and when. And this is important because if you really are able to log every event in your system, it's amazing how quickly disks fill up. So you want to decide very early on, are you interested in seeing these events? So before they're even generated, you want to make a decision about whether they're going to consume I/O resources and memory resources. And we have a configuration system that allows you to select which users have which events logged for them, how do we get into this, what are we interested in logging. On the whole, the security standards require audit events for any event relating to security. And they define events relating to security in terms of security requirements. And if you look at the common criteria spec, it says you must authenticate users, you must perform access control, you must be able to manage the system. So anytime you have an event that falls into one of those categories, there's a requirement for it to be audited. We are also able to audit a large number of events that aren't required by common criteria. But if you look at the way Unix systems work, it turns out almost everything has to do with security, because you're almost always making a security decision. Does the user own the file they're trying to write to? Are they allowed to read the directory they're about to read from? Any event that involves files is a security event in a Unix system, so those are all logged events. So most system calls, for example, check to see if the user is a super user. I think even stat checks to see if the user is a super user, which comes out of trying to mask the file generation number so that people cannot forge NFS file handles, which is, I think, increasingly historically unnecessary privilege check, but it's certainly the case that it happens. So continuous access control checks in the kernel, and obviously in user space we have lots of events like login and access control decisions involving setting up groups. So user space also needs to generate audit records. Account management, you have to be able to audit the creation of accounts, the deletion of accounts, adding and moving to groups, all these sorts of things. And of course, we have to audit changes to the audits. When we set about to implement this, we were actually implementing it on Mac OS X first as part of their common criteria evaluation. And we basically looked around to see how have people done audit already. And if you look at what people have done, the two de facto industry standards are the way NT did it and the way Solaris did it. And guess which one of those two we picked? So we chose to implement, you may see here, Sun's BSM audit trail format, which is a well-defined file format for audit trails, and their API, which means that if there were existing applications that speak audit, they still do so. For example, the SSH support for audit that comes out of Solaris works out of the box on FreeBSD. So it just happened. If you have intrusion detection tools for Solaris and they use BSM audit trails, they will generally just work on FreeBSD trails. You can just input them straight in. The reliability requirements for audit are quite interesting. Audit must get records to disk for events that have been selected. What does this mean? Well, it means if you're unable to write them to disk, then the event isn't allowed to happen. So the reliability requirements are quite tricky. One of the requirements coming out of the C2 spec was if you were unable to log the event, then you must halt the machine. So you have to keep track of all the available space for log records so you can see how much space is remaining. Now, we don't turn that feature on by default, but we do actually support it. The audit system is able to maintain a maximum amount of buffered audit records in memory so that if the power fails, you have guarantees about how many records are on disk and how many aren't. So you can say, okay, I'm willing to lose at least no more than 64 audit records, or maybe I'm willing to lose several thousand because I'm really interested in performance and not slowing the system down at the rate of I/O for audit records. And these are quite important requirements because you need these guarantees if you're going to reason about post-mortem analysis. One of the key features was how do you control what's logged. We use the same configuration file formats as present on Solaris. So if you have existing Solaris configurations, it just works. And you're basically able to look at users and say, well, I'm interested in all of the files opened by this user, but for this user, I'm only interested in logins. And we use Unix protections in the file system to protect the log records. This is actually just like syslog. So if your root account is compromised and you're only running with discretionary protections, not mandatory protections, then your audit log is potentially compromised also. This used to actually be quite a controversial point. I think it's much less controversial now because a lot of the compromises in systems aren't operating system compromises anymore. We've done a very good job of starting to track those down and clear those up. A lot of them are application compromises. So the PHP example doesn't involve any compromise of operating system code, yet you still want a reliable operating system trail. So the file format is a binary file format. There's also the ability to output these into a couple of different text formats. Most recently in FreeBSD 7, we added the ability to output in XML, which means it's fairly universally possible, but there's also something that's a bit more preferable. And what kind of information do you get? Well, what kind of event is it? Somebody's logged in using SSH. What time did they do it? Who did they do it as? Where did they log in from? But all the information is available in a parsable format from the application, so you can actually do mechanical process management. For the exec event, what time did it take place? What program did they run? What were the arguments to it? Provide some information on the file that was actually executed. Was the name of the file CSH, but it turned out to have a set UID bit on it? That would be a little surprising. Where were they logged in from when they ran the command? So this is quite useful information for post-mortem. So I said, these things, we log all sorts of stuff. We log path accesses, we log accesses to the network, what TCP sockets were opened. There is the potential for a huge amount of data. In fact, terabytes of data now on a busy system fully audited. So obviously you need a system in which to cut these down to select only the things you want to know about. And we actually support two kinds of selection. One of these is called pre-selection, which has to do with what records you generate at the time the event is occurring. So, what information do you want up front immediately? How much I/O load do you want to put on the kernel? And then we have something called post-selection, which has to do with reducing the logs later. Do you want to do this because you're interested in archiving different things over time? For 1 week, you keep a list of every command run on the system. After a month, you're interested only in login and logout information. And then eventually, maybe you're only interested in system events like reboots and shutdowns and things like that, or users added and removed. And so we support both of these. When the user logs in, we set up their audit state for their processes and all the processes derived from it. And this is done using configuration files per user. So when a user logs in, they might get all their XX logged. I'm interested, for example, on my shell server in every command run by an authenticated user. So I'm able to log that along with command line arguments. But maybe for the web server user, I'm less interested in every XX that's taking place. Maybe I want to know about certain file accesses. And then maybe you run a cron script once in a while that reduces the audit logs that you have to date, or you go through and you compress them as they get cycled. And we support both of those models. Reduction is an interesting thing. We have a tool that takes audit streams, and these can be files or they can be pipelines, and then cuts out records. It's a little like grep for an audit trail. So you can say, find me all the records in this trail that correspond to a specific user or a specific group or a specific file, which is quite useful. One of the things that we've added that wasn't present in most of the audit systems in commercial operating systems was something called audit pipes. And this comes out of the desire to do intrusion detection. So audit trails are these reliably stored files on disk. They're owned by the audit subsystem. They get into a special partition in a special file format. They're controlled by all these login files. But if you have an intrusion detection system, you may be interested in changing the set of records you're gathering over time. You may have a daemon that's sitting there and says, oh, this user logged in and then they ran this command. That's very strange. I think I'd like you to start gathering more information on what these processes are doing. Or instead of reliably guaranteeing that they get to disk, give me a lossy stream. So tell me when you start falling behind, you can't generate records, but don't slow the system down. Just tell me what's going on. And we did this using something called audit pipe, which is actually a device node. You open/dev/audit pipe. You attach to it. You can issue IOPTLs on it to control the set of records being generated from the system independently of the global configuration or any other pipe. And then you're programmed to sit there looping on events as they come in and processing them. This is not something that's present in SPARTA. Audit is actually pretty well documented. We have a lot of man pages on file formats and so on. We also have a handbook chapter on setting it up. We also have something called Open BSM, which is essentially well, when we started this work, Solaris wasn't open source. So we had to re-implement all the library functions and parsing and documentation and so on. We went ahead and did that. It is now still the only available BSD licensed BSM file. I actually test and use it on Linux, and it is also hopefully being adopted into Mac OS 10 in order to keep their implementation in sync with ours. So this is something that's potentially of use if you want to bring audit to another operating system platform. And we have an implementation paper that was presented at UKU GK Project. So in conclusion, audit is actually a remarkably useful tool. I find it incredibly useful in debugging. I have used it in post-mortem environments, but actually keeping a log of every command run for a week or so afterwards in a very detailed way, including where the person logged in from and maybe all the TCP connections that took place. Incredibly useful for understanding the behavior of the web server. So I guess I would recommend it both for monitoring use and also for security use. In FreeBSD 6.2, this is considered an experimental feature. It's not available by default in the generic kernel. In FreeBSD 7, it is in generic, and in FreeBSD 6.3, I think they'd also like to ship it in the generic kernel. I'd also mention that there are two things that went on this summer in the Google Summer of Code. A distributed audit daemon was written by one of our students. This allows you to manage audit centrally and distribute audit trails across machines. You can have a central audit server and it pulls in all the audit trails as they're generated. This is part of addressing the question, what do you do about the fact that the root user is able to modify audit trails on disk while you move them to a central machine that has different security properties? Maybe they're taken there for archives or they go to read-only media. We also have a graphical viewing and analysis tool now. It's a little like Wireshark for audit trails. You can load up the file into it and you can say, okay, now show me all the records that reflect this user. Okay, now maybe show all the files they access in, etc. That's quite a useful tool, and that's very much in beta still, but it could be quite useful, I think. The last thing I want to talk to you about is manager access control. Earlier on I told you about discretionary access control and manager access control. It has to do with who is allowed to control the protections. Historically, mandatory access control referred to the military security model, multi-level security, in which you're concerned very much about secrecy. Is an object classified? Is it confidential? All this sort of concept of you can read down, but you can't read up. You can write up, but you can't write down. I would say this is irrelevant in the current world. Certainly, lots and lots of MLR systems. But when we use the term mandatory access control, we're actually referring to something more broad. We're referring to the fact that the administrator can change the policies on the operating system to control all the users there, regardless of whether the users are interested. And while we are interested in information flow and things like multi-level security, we're also interested in things like hardening policies, controlling the access, users' access and files owned by other users in a mandatory way, regardless of the permissions on the file. So there are a couple of steps, and I said earlier on that there's some research involved here. One of the research questions is, how do you change the access control policy of the operating system without breaking the operating system horribly? And very early on in this work, when we were starting to implement different access control policies for FreeBSD, we noticed that we were doing a lot of the same work over and over again. You decide you want to introduce a new policy. The policy is going to have security labels on files. It's going to change access control in the file system, and maybe also in sockets. Oh, we're going to put all these hooks in place, we're going to put in calls to these new security checks. And now we're going to have two policies, and we discover all the hooks are in the same places. So one of our other design choices was to create a framework that allows you to change the operating system access control policy. And that's what the MAC framework does. It is all about loadable kernel modules or compile time policies loading into the kernel and augmenting all security decisions in the kernel. They might choose just to implement changes to file systems or sockets, but there's the capability there to pretty much influence every access control decision in the kernel. In practice, we see two kinds of policies. One of these is an information flow policy. This is a ubiquitous policy in which new security labels are attached to objects in the system. So if you've ever used SE/Linux, SE/Linux implements something called type enforcement, which is a label-based policy. You go to each file and you sign in a label, and then you make access control decisions by looking at the label on the process and the label on the file. So that's the kind of thing we're talking about there. So we have implementations of several of these. We're also interested in hardening policies, which tend to be lower maintenance. This is for administrators who want to change the access control properties of the operating system in a constrained way. Maybe they just want to change the rules about who can bind sockets for TCP. Okay, the worldwide web user is only allowed to bind port 80. They're not allowed to bind any other port in the system, and that's quite important. So, as I said, we have a lot of these policies. We ship some with the operating system. Some are available from third parties. In the labeled area, probably generally of less interest to the general audience, we have a fixed label integrity policy in which all objects in the system are assigned integrity levels and integrity compartments. We also have multi-level security, so support for the so-called military model, and LOMAC, which is a floating label integrity policy, which is quite interesting, and a partitioning policy. On the hardening front, we ship a port access controllers model. You load the kernel module, and now you can set which users are allowed to bind which ports and make connections from which ports. We have one for controlling interactions between different users. And we have one called UGIDFW, which is a firewall policy for the file system. So you can establish a set of rules that control what users are allowed to access files owned by what other users. And this is quite useful in ISP-like environments, where you basically want to assert globally that users cannot read each other's files. And there's just no way to do that in Unix out of the box. It's actually quite tricky to express that, especially if you don't want users to accidentally reveal their files, which they turn out to be very good at doing. We also have several third-party models, things like cryptographically signed binary checking. It also checks shared libraries as programs execute. We have a port of the SE/Linux Flask and type enforcement policy that runs on FreeBSD. We have a privilege policy that allows you to allocate operating system privileges at a fairly granular level to specific users. There are also a number of proprietary policies running in various products. For example, Secure Computing's Sidewinder firewall has their own implementation of type enforcement based on the MAC framework. And one of the goals of this project when we did it was to allow people who produce appliances based on FreeBSD to customize the security model of the operating system without changing the operating system throughout the kernel, without having to change the DFS and all these other things. So that policy pretty much just plugs into an unmodified FreeBSD kernel on the whole. Recently, Apple announced they've adopted the MAC framework into Mac OS X Leopard. They have a number of different security policies where we can't go into in any detail as the product is not shipping yet. But suffice to say, they've done some extremely interesting things. Some things that I never expected would be done with a mandatory access control framework. For example, parental controls are implemented using mandatory access control. So I think there will be some very, very upset 12-year-olds. But they also do some other quite interesting things, like data tainting and stuff like that. So it's quite interesting. And hopefully, many of those policies will be able to run on FreeBSD with relatively little adaptation. Let me just give you one example of a mandatory access control policy that's sort of more generally useful than some of these floating label policies. And this is this user group file system file pick. And as I said, the goal of the policy is to allow you to control interactions between users using the file system. So you might have 100 users on the system, and you really want them only interacting in certain ways. You want the worldwide web user to be able to read anyone's files, but not write everyone's files. You want users in the student group to never be able to read or write files owned by the staff group on this particular file system. So this allows you to do that using a tool that really looks like a firewall management tool. You set up a number of rules. It iterates over these rules whenever there's a file system access, and it decides which one is the best match. There are different ways this can be done. And then it goes ahead and imposes restrictions on what are allowed by permissions. So I just have one example here, which is UGIDFW set rule 100. If the process is owned by the web user and the object is owned by the user Robert, then you can read, you can execute in stat, but you cannot write. And this will override all permissions in the system. It's quite a useful tool. There's a lot of documentation for this too. We have several man pages just about managing manager access control. We have a handbook chapter which sort of goes through some of the basics of setting up a limited number of the policies. We also have some implementation papers that go into the research aspects of it and how it's implemented. And I expect that we'll actually start seeing a lot more of this now that Mac OS X is coming out and has the right set of policies. So I kind of quickly went through 3 of the new security features that appear in FreeBSD that are at least new with respect to the Unix security model. And I think when looking at them, you can see how they start to fill the gaps left in the Unix security model. If you require detailed logging of the system for security purposes, I mean, obviously Unix doesn't do that. And Audit provides that in a pretty neat and compatible way. I think it's very pleasing that we're able to use the same file format as appears in Solaris, and Apple has also picked up the same file format. So if you have audit trails from Mac OS X, Solaris, and FreeBSD, they're all immediately interoperable, which is really quite useful, and all the command line tools can be run on each of these files, which is quite helpful. Access control lists. As I say, there are management issues in using access control lists in the same way that there are for permissions, but these turn out to be very practical tools when you want to have a series of users interacting if you're managing web pages with CGI submissions. Users can now say things like, I don't want the directory to be board writable just because I need a CGI to write there. I want the web user to be able to write there. And that alone is a quite useful tool. And then manager access control, which as we originally introduced, I think mostly to help appliance vendors who have custom security requirements, but turns out to be a much more general tool. Right now, Mac is not in the FreeBSD generic panel. I have some hopes that in 8 we'll be able to bring it in by default. You can find out more about all these things by looking at the FreeBSD handbook and at the TrustedBSD website. If there are any questions?
About the operating system, is there anything on the when logs are done on the local host? Is there something to ensure that no logs were changed, that all logs are real or not fake, and to ensure that no log entry have been deleted, or do we have to log on another host?
Right. Well, okay. So as it stands, the policy is that discretionary access control protects the files. There's an audit group that allows users in that group to review the files but not change them. If you're the root user, then you have the ability to change the files on disk as they stand. They're stored in the file system. Right now, there are no built-in facilities to digitally sign the audit records as they're generated. I think there would be some very interesting questions about how you would do that reliably on a single system, because you have to store the keys somewhere in some persistent form so that you could then perform occasional signatures. My recommendation would be to spool them out to a second system or to write one's media. You don't store a whole lot of write one's media anymore. It used to be one drives are common, but not so much. So I think that the distributed way is the best way to go. If you're running with an integrity policy, like the Viva integrity policy, you can actually do things like mark the audit daemon and all the audit files as high integrity. And even if the user gets root privilege of low integrity, they're not going to be able to access these files. So if you're running with a more complex policy, then you're able to express more interesting things. One of the examples we have of what you might do, so audit once in a while will rotate the log files. So you can say, when a log file reaches a megabyte, rotate it, start writing into a new one, terminate the previous one, rename it so it has date stamps at the beginning and the end and so on. And a script runs when that happens. So if you wanted to do occasional signing or occasional offload or other cryptographic operations, you could set the intervals which you want that to happen. But there's no built-in tool to do that. The one thing the distributed audit daemon doesn't currently do is sign them before they leave the host. I think it would actually be quite neat to add that, and I think it wouldn't be hard to add.
Okay. What you just described sounds a lot like SOClog. Did you look at that? And
I'm sorry, could you repeat?
What you just described sounds a lot like SOClog. Did you look at that tool?
I'm not familiar with SOClog. Can you tell us more?
Basically, it's much like the DJV's daemon tools, except it's kind of rewritten to more mature. I don't recall the author's name. It's
Is it able to audit things like file opens?
Well, no, it doesn't do any auditing. It's a logging facility, one they divide in location.
I've not looked at it in answer to the question. I think it sounds like there would probably be a good match. Nothing says you can't use existing tools that manage logs to work with audit. You would have to. So you can send signals to the audit daemon and say, okay, go ahead and rotate it. You can send it messages to say, please terminate whatever file you're currently generating and then just hand it over and don't touch it again. So if you want to pick up log files using another tool, you can certainly do that. The volume of audit records is such that we actually directly write them from the kernel to the file. So there is an audit daemon, but it's just for management purposes. And I think you wouldn't want to introduce a process that had to receive every message before before it can be written out to the file system or sent over the network in the common case because of the performance hit. So that's a design decision I think we should. The other reason it's in the kernel, actually, the logging and not just the capture of the events, is that only the kernel has complete information about how much has been written to disk. So only the kernel can enforce the guarantee that the number of outstanding log messages is below a certain maximum. So I think that bit also has to remain where it is to provide guarantees. But in terms of managing the log files, I mean, they're files in the file system. So if you wanted to use another tool, there's no reason not to do that. And if there are changes that need to be made to the audit name and support, that kind of thing, I think we'd be quite happy to make them. Any other questions?
Yeah. Would it be hard to have some kind of mechanism that extends this thing to let's say, network traffic? I once emailed you being able to say in some kind of policy everything that comes out of the internet is not allowed to progress further into your network. So have some kind of tagging, labeling of that.
So you could do that with mandatory access control. In fact, we already implement a policy that can do that. You can, if you use, for example, the integrity policy, you can mark one network interface as being low integrity and the other as high integrity, and no traffic will be allowed to pass between them unless it goes through a trusted process that performs essentially a change in classification to raise it to high integrity. So you can have a series of trusted processes on the system that have labels that allow you to do that, and then a series of untrusted processes on each side that do regular things. And an example, so one of the common things to do with type enforcement, which is the policy used by SE Linux, is something called a trusted pipeline, where you label the two network interfaces. Then you have a set of processes that sit between them, passing the data through, and they're all labeled such that each one can only pass it to the next stage in the pipeline. So you have something that listens on the sockets on both sides, HTTP on one side, HTTP on the other, and then you have some scrubbers, and a caching piece, and some access control pieces, and an antivirus piece. And each of them, the middle pieces, like antivirus, can't connect directly to the network. It can only talk to the two sides of the pipeline. So if you look at a product like Security Reading Sidewinder, they actually do this in the product. And you can certainly use the tools that we provide to do exactly that. Any other questions? Well, thank you very much.